Greg Cook is most likely a name you've never heard of, but I'll bet you have heard of legendary NFL coaches like Bill Walsh and Paul Brown. Walsh and Brown coached some of the best QBs ever to play, such as Joe Montana, Steve Young, and Otto Graham, to name a few. But when asked about the most talented quarterback they'd ever seen play, they didn't say it was any of these Hall of Famers. Instead, they both agreed that it was Greg Cook. As a rookie in 1969, Cook emerged as one of the most promising young players in the NFL, and he even took home the AFL's Rookie of the Year award. But after this season, it looks like Cook just vanished from the game. No stats, no accolades, nothing. So what happened to him? That's what I'm getting into today, so get set, because this is the story of one of the biggest what-ifs in NFL history, Greg Cook. Greg Cook was an Ohio kid through and through. He was born and raised in Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was a multi-sport athlete, but known for his stellar play on the football field. When it came time to decide where to play in college, he chose to stay in-state and attend the University of Cincinnati. Cook played at Cincinnati from 1966 to 1968, and in short, he was a Bearcat legend. In his 3 years starring for the Bearcats, he set 15 school records such as single-season passing yards, touchdowns, and longest touchdown pass. In his college career overall, he threw for just under 5,000 yards and 34 touchdowns. The bulk of his stats came as a senior in 1968 when he threw for 3,200 yards and 25 touchdowns, with his best performance coming in a game against Ohio where he threw for 554 yards, which is a school record that still stands to this day. Coach Paul Brown, who is considered the godfather of coaching in the NFL, once attended a Bearcats game to scout prior to the draft. But Cook and Cincinnati fell behind to Miami of Ohio 21-6 in the second half, so Brown decided to leave the game. But the next day, Brown found out that Cook managed to lead the Bearcats to an improbable comeback victory, and after watching the game film, Brown knew that he wanted Cook as his quarterback. At the end of the 1968 season, Cook was named an All-American, and he was a hot commodity coming into the 1969 NFL Draft, standing at 6 feet 4 inches with insane arm talent and field vision. Now, for a long time, Coach Paul Brown was at the helm of the Cleveland Browns organization, but after a falling out with ownership, he left and started the Cincinnati Bengals in the spring of 1967. He was an Ohio guy, and he wanted an Ohio guy to lead his offense, so with the 5th overall pick, the young Bengals selected Greg Cook to be their quarterback of the future. And this pick looked to pay off early on as Cook started off his rookie year in 1969 on fire. Cook became the first rookie quarterback to start the first game of the season for the Bengals in franchise history, and crazy enough, this wouldn't happen again until over 40 years later when Andy Dalton would come along in 2011. He looked as though he was already a veteran quarterback early on, with his great field vision, elusiveness, decision-making, and crazy arm talent. Things were looking good, and Cook led the Bengals to a 3-0 record heading into their Week 4 matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs, but this is when everything would change. The game started off well until midway through, Cook was brought down hard by Chiefs linebacker Jim Lynch, and when he went down, he felt a pop in his throwing shoulder. He didn't know what happened, but what he did know was that it hurt and he couldn't move his shoulder well enough to throw the ball, so he exited the game. After some evaluation, the Bengals medical staff thought he had just suffered a significant bruise or a possible sprain of some kind to his shoulder, so the rookie QB sat out the next 3 weeks to rest and recover. Because of the limited medical technology of the time, there was really no way to determine what actually happened to Cook's shoulder at the time unless he underwent surgery. But little did he or the Bengals medical staff know that this was much more than just a bruised shoulder. But after 3 weeks, Cook decided it was long enough and he decided to return to play. To help reduce the pain, he took shots of cortisone before each game and he just kind of learned to play through it. And while Cook never expressed exactly how he was feeling, the Bengals coaching staff could sense that something was wrong. Despite all this, Cook managed to continue his impressive play, and he finished the year playing in 11 games where he threw for just under 1,900 yards and 15 touchdowns, with another 150 yards and 1 TD on the ground. During his first year as a pro, he set rookie records for yards per pass attempt with 9.4 and yards per completion with 17.5, and both of these records still stand today. Even though he missed a few games and was playing through an injury, he actually managed to win the AFL's passing title, and as a result of his successful rookie season, he was named the AFL's Rookie of the Year. His future was looking bright, but unfortunately, the offseason proved to be devastating. Cook didn't realize it at the time, but because he continued to play, his shoulder began to deteriorate more and more quickly over time. So as the offseason went on, the pain he felt in his shoulder increased drastically and his arm strength began to disappear. It was decided that Cook would undergo surgery to figure out exactly what the issue was, and as a result, he'd be sidelined for the entire 1970 season. When he went into surgery, doctors found out that the pain he was feeling in his shoulder wasn't due to a long-lasting bruise or sprain, but it was actually a torn rotator cuff. And back then, this was basically a career-ending injury for a quarterback. And just to add to the already bad news, doctors also found that along with the torn rotator cuff, Cook also partially detached his bicep muscle. So basically, he managed to win the AFL passing title while virtually playing without the use of his throwing arm, which doesn't even sound humanly possible, but that just goes to show how talented of a player he was. Even though the torn rotator cuff usually served as an early gateway into retirement for quarterbacks, the Bengals wanted to try everything to get their young star QB back to action, hoping that he'd eventually be able to recover and regain his old form. The first surgery didn't take though, and he ultimately underwent 3 surgeries to try and correct his issues, but nothing helped. He went on to miss the 1971 and 1972 seasons as a result. And even though his injuries were still lingering, he grew frustrated with all the missed time, so Cook decided to try and return to play in 1973 after missing 3 entire years. Unfortunately, the Bengals drafted a new young QB back in 1971 by the name of Ken Anderson, and like Cook a few years prior, Anderson was now flourishing as a star. So when Cook returned to play, he did so in a backup role, and in the 1973 season, he would only see action in 1 game, totaling 3 pass attempts with just 1 completion. After this disappointing return, he made the decision to retire, at least at first. Ironically, Cook's last chance in the NFL came with the same team that was responsible for his downfall, the Kansas City Chiefs. Just like his first encounter with the Chiefs, he'd be let down, as the team decided not to sign him to their roster. Following this, Cook's once promising career had officially ended, and he returned back to his life in Cincinnati, where he was forced to watch Ken Anderson have the career he hoped he would have had, filled with Pro Bowls and Super Bowl appearances. Old friends and teammates of Cook's all say that even though they felt his injury took a toll on him psychologically, he never showed it, at least not outwardly. He was always just grateful for the experience and the short term of success he did have while playing. Cook was beloved in the Cincinnati community, and by all accounts, even though he was always happy to help others, he would never actually ask for any help for himself, and as it turned out, he needed it. Now, following his football career, he did work, but it seemed like he never knew exactly what he wanted to do. He spent time working for UPS, then served as a radio analyst for the University of Cincinnati's football team in the late 80s, and from the outside looking in, Greg Cook still seemed to be happy and put together. But in later years, he poured his energy into being an artist, something he'd always had a passion for, even majoring in art during his college years. And while he was a talented painter, it wasn't exactly paying the bills, so he actually got a job working as a salesman for an organization that partnered with different charitable organizations. But as the years went on, the underlying psychological toll of having his dreams shattered decades ago still lingered inside of Cook, and he almost seemed to disappear at times. Eventually, it was found out that he'd actually been living in an abandoned pigment factory where he was surrounded by raccoons and unhealthy breathing air. Here, he had been focusing on his painting, but going back to the psychological effect mentioned earlier, the odd thing about many of his paintings were that they were unfinished. He'd start out on a project and it'd look great, like it would turn into a masterpiece, but he just didn't finish them, so no one would ever know exactly how it would have turned out. And this is the exact same thing that happened to his football career. He started out great, it looked like he could have been a Hall of Famer even, but it was cut short, so we'll never know. In 2012, Cook was hospitalized for pneumonia, and sadly, this is how he would lose his life. Following Cook's passing, Coach Paul Brown's son, Mike Brown, who is now the owner of the team, released a statement that read, "Greg was the single most talented player we've ever had with the Bengals. His career was tragically short due to the injury. Had he been able to stay healthy, I believe he would have been the player of his era in the NFL." As time passes, Cook seems to be remembered less and less, largely because there was only a fraction of his NFL highlights out there, and obviously because his time in the league was so short. But when you read what his former teammates, coaches, and even opponents say about him, one thing is clear: everyone seems to believe he was the most talented quarterback they'd ever seen play. And the version of Cook they all refer to isn't even a healthy one, as he was able to achieve this high praise all while playing with a torn rotator cuff and detached biceps muscle. If he had come along 20 to 30 years later, his story would be completely different. For instance, NFL great QB Drew Brees suffered almost this exact same injury only a few years into his career, but after having it properly treated through surgery and rehab, he went on to play for 16 more years, racking up accolades, a Super Bowl championship, and NFL records along the way. Greg Cook was gifted in every way as a football player. Good size, natural ability, high football IQ, but the only thing he didn't have was the gift of time. And I think this quote by NFL Hall of Fame coach Bill Walsh, who was actually Cook's offensive coordinator during his rookie season, sums up Cook's career best. What a great, great talent. What a terrible shame. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. If you did, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me out tremendously as I try to grow the page. But until next time, get set because I'll have another story coming to you soon.